Hello, everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. I'm a hematologist at Presbyterian Medical Center in Denver, Colorado. Or at least I was until I submitted my resignation last month. You can call me Dr. Sarah Chen if you want, though most people in the lab just called me the blood doctor during my 18 years there. I've seen everything you can imagine in hematology: leukemia, anemia, clotting disorders, rare blood cancers, and every kind of abnormality that human blood can present. But what I'm about to tell you about is the one case that made me question everything I thought I knew about biology and ultimately led me to leave the profession entirely. Presbyterian Medical Center is a major teaching hospital serving the Denver metropolitan area and parts of northern Colorado. It's a comprehensive facility with one of the most advanced hematology laboratories in the region, handling over 200,000 blood samples per year. During my time there, I specialized in analyzing unusual blood disorders, consulting on cases that other labs couldn't explain, and working with patients whose blood work defied conventional understanding. The case I'm about to tell you about began on a cold Thursday morning in January 2023. It was January 12th to be exact, and I had arrived at the lab around 6:30 a.m. for what I expected to be a routine day of blood analysis and patient consultations. The morning started normally enough. I reviewed overnight results, checked on several ongoing cases involving rare platelet disorders, and prepared for a 9 a.m. consultation with an oncology patient whose white cell count had been fluctuating in ways that concerned her treatment team. But at 7:45 a.m., everything changed when my lab technician, Marcus Rodriguez, approached me with an expression I had never seen in his 12 years of working with me. "Dr. Chen, we have a situation with the overnight samples," Marcus said, his voice carrying a tension that immediately got my attention. "There's something you need to see, and I honestly don't know how to explain it." Marcus was one of the most experienced technicians in our department. He had processed thousands of blood samples, seen every kind of abnormality imaginable, and was known for his calm demeanor even when dealing with the most unusual cases. If Marcus was concerned, there was definitely something worth investigating. "What kind of situation are we talking about?" I asked, following him toward the main analysis station where several other technicians had gathered around one particular microscope. "It's the sample from bed 14 in the ICU," Marcus explained. "Patient came in last night with severe anemia, but the blood work is showing things that shouldn't be possible." The sample was collected around midnight from a 34-year-old male patient who had been brought to the emergency department by paramedics after collapsing at his apartment. According to the initial report, neighbors had found him unconscious on his kitchen floor, pale and barely breathing, with no obvious signs of trauma or injury. The patient, who we'll call David Martinez to protect his identity, had no known medical history, took no medications, and had no family history of blood disorders. He was previously healthy, worked as a software engineer, and had last been seen by his co-workers just 2 days earlier, appearing completely normal. The paramedics noted that his skin had an unusual grayish pallor and his vital signs were consistent with severe blood loss, though there was no evidence of external bleeding or internal trauma on initial examination. When David arrived at the hospital, his hemoglobin level was critically low at 4.2 grams per deciliter. For reference, normal hemoglobin levels for adult males range from 13.5 to 17.5 grams per deciliter. David's level was so low that he should have been in severe distress, possibly unconscious, and at immediate risk of cardiac arrest. Yet remarkably, while he was weak and pale, his vital signs were more stable than anyone expected given such severe anemia. The attending physician in the ICU, Dr. Michael Thompson, had ordered immediate blood work to determine the cause of David's condition and to prepare for an emergency blood transfusion. That's when the sample arrived in our lab. And that's when everything started to become inexplicable. I looked into the microscope at David's blood sample, and what I saw challenged every principle of hematology I'd learned during my medical training and career. The red blood cells, which should have been round and uniform in shape, were displaying patterns and formations I had never encountered in 18 years of practice. Instead of the typical disc-shaped cells floating randomly in the plasma, David's red blood cells were arranging themselves in precise geometric patterns, perfect hexagons, symmetrical spirals, and complex lattice structures that looked almost crystalline in their organization. "This is impossible," I said to Marcus, adjusting the microscope focus to make sure I wasn't seeing some kind of optical illusion or equipment malfunction. "Red blood cells don't organize themselves like this. They don't have the cellular machinery to create these kinds of formations." But as I continued to examine the sample, the patterns became even more elaborate and unmistakable. I called over Dr. Patricia Williams, our senior hematologist, who had been practicing for over 25 years and had seen cases from medical centers across the country. Patricia examined the sample carefully, spending nearly 20 minutes looking at different areas of the slide, checking and rechecking her observations. Her expression grew increasingly puzzled as she worked. "Sarah, in all my years of practice, I've never seen anything remotely like this," Patricia said, stepping back from the microscope. "These formations are too complex and too organized to be random cellular behavior. But I can't think of any known disease process, genetic condition, or external factor that would cause red blood cells to arrange themselves in these patterns." We decided to run additional tests to rule out laboratory error or sample contamination. We prepared fresh slides from the same sample, used different staining techniques, and examined the blood under various magnifications and lighting conditions. Every test confirmed the same extraordinary finding. David's red blood cells were organizing themselves in ways that defied biological explanation. The most disturbing aspect wasn't just the geometric patterns themselves, but the fact that the formations seemed to be changing over time. When I examined the same slide 30 minutes later, the patterns had shifted into new configurations. The hexagons had transformed into interlocking circles, the spirals had reversed direction, and entirely new structures had appeared that looked almost like miniature architectural blueprints. "What?" Dr. Chen, Marcus called from across the lab. "There's something else you need to see." He had been monitoring the sample under continuous observation and had been taking photographs every few minutes to document the changes. When he showed me the time-lapse sequence, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air-conditioned laboratory. The red blood cells weren't just forming random patterns. They were creating what appeared to be symbols, letters, and eventually what looked like actual words. The formations were precise, deliberate, and clearly intentional. It was as if David's blood was trying to communicate something, using his own cells as a medium for some kind of message. "This can't be happening," I said, staring at the photographs that clearly showed letters and symbols formed by organized red blood cells. Blood cells don't have consciousness. They don't communicate. They don't form letters or words. We were looking at something that challenged not just medical understanding, but our basic comprehension of biology and consciousness itself. I immediately called Dr. Thompson in the ICU to discuss David's condition and to get more information about his medical history and current status. What I learned only deepened the mystery surrounding this extraordinary case. "Dr. Thompson, I need to ask you some specific questions about the patient in bed 14, I said when he answered the phone. "Has David Martinez shown any unusual behavior since his admission? Any changes in consciousness or neurological symptoms?" "The patient has been in and out of consciousness since arrival," Dr. Thompson replied. "When he's awake, he's coherent and can answer basic questions. But there's something odd about his responses. He keeps asking about time, specifically what year it is and how long he's been unconscious. When we tell him it's January 2023, he becomes agitated and insists that's impossible. Have you noticed anything else unusual about his physical condition besides the severe anemia? Any skin changes, neurological deficits, or other symptoms that don't fit a typical blood loss presentation?" "Actually, yes. His temperature has been fluctuating in ways that don't make medical sense. One minute he's hypothermic at 94 degrees, the next he's running a fever of 102. His pupils are reactive, but they dilate and constrict in patterns that don't correspond to light exposure. And there's something else that's been bothering me. His blood pressure and heart rate should be critically unstable given his hemoglobin levels, but they're maintaining within normal ranges as if his body has somehow adapted to function with almost no red blood cells." I hung up the phone and returned to the microscope, where the blood sample continued to display its impossible behavior. The cellular formations had evolved again. and now the red blood cells were creating what appeared to be mathematical equations. Perfect numerical sequences, algebraic formulas, and geometric theorems that would have been impressive if drawn by hand, let alone formed by supposedly mindless blood cells. Patricia, I need you to document everything we're seeing here, I said. Take photographs, videos, detailed notes. Either we're witnessing something that will revolutionize our understanding of cellular biology, or we're all experiencing some kind of collective hallucination. Over the next several hours, we called in additional specialists from various departments. Dr. Robert Kim from neurology, Dr. Lisa Rodriguez from infectious diseases, Dr. James Park from genetics, and Dr. Michelle Foster from psychiatry. Each expert examined David's blood sample and his medical condition, and each one left more puzzled than when they arrived. The neurologist found no evidence of brain injury or neurological disease that could explain David's condition. The infectious disease specialist ran every test imaginable for parasites, viruses, bacteria, and fungi, all of which came back negative. The geneticist ordered comprehensive DNA analysis to look for rare genetic mutations that might cause unusual red blood cell behavior. The psychiatrist evaluated David for potential psychological factors that might somehow influence his blood chemistry. None of the consultations provided any answers, but they all confirmed that we were dealing with something unprecedented in medical literature. By Thursday afternoon, the blood sample had begun forming what could only be described as written messages. The red blood cells arranged themselves into clear, readable text that appeared to be addressing whoever was observing them. The first message was simple but chilling. We need to talk. Marcus and I stared at the microscope display in complete silence for several minutes. I had examined thousands of blood samples throughout my career, analyzed every conceivable type of cellular abnormality, and consulted on cases that had stumped medical experts across the country. But I had never encountered anything that challenged my understanding of reality to this extent. The message remained visible for approximately 15 minutes before the cells reorganized into a new formation. This time, the text was more elaborate. The body is borrowed, the mind remains. Help us return. I immediately called hospital administration to report the situation and request guidance on how to proceed. The conversation with Chief of Staff Dr. Margaret Sullivan was one of the most difficult of my career. Dr. Chen, are you telling me that a blood sample is writing messages? Dr. Sullivan asked, her tone reflecting the skepticism I would have expected from anyone hearing this report. I understand how this sounds, but I have multiple witnesses, extensive photographic documentation, and video evidence of what we're observing. This is not a laboratory error, equipment malfunction, or misinterpretation of normal cellular behavior. David Martinez's red blood cells are organizing themselves in ways that appear to be intentionally communicative. Dr. Sullivan agreed to come to the laboratory personally to observe the phenomenon. When she arrived an hour later, accompanied by the hospital's medical director and legal counsel, the blood sample was displaying its most complex message yet. Time is running short. The connection weakens. Please understand we are not meant to be here. The room fell silent as the medical leadership observed something that defied every principle of modern medicine. Dr. Sullivan examined the sample herself, checked our equipment for malfunctions, and questioned our methodology in detail. Finally, she turned to me with an expression I had never seen from her in our 15 years of working together. Dr. Chen, I need you to prepare a comprehensive report on everything you've observed. But I also need you to understand that this information cannot leave this room until we determine how to proceed. We're dealing with something that could fundamentally challenge public understanding of medical science, and we need to be extremely careful about how we handle it. Throughout Thursday evening and into Friday morning, I remained in the laboratory monitoring David's blood sample around the clock. The messages continued to appear with increasing urgency and complexity. Some contained mathematical formulas I didn't recognize. Others included references to dates, locations, and events that seemed to have personal significance to someone, though we had no way of knowing to whom. The most disturbing message appeared around 3 a.m. on Friday. David cannot sustain this much longer. We must return before the vessel fails completely. Please help us find the way home. It was becoming clear that whatever was communicating through David's blood was not David himself. The messages referred to him in the third person, as if some other consciousness was inhabiting his body and using his blood cells as a means of communication. The implications were staggering and terrifying. By Friday morning, David's condition had begun to deteriorate rapidly despite multiple blood transfusions. His hemoglobin levels would temporarily improve after each transfusion, but within hours, the new blood would begin displaying the same impossible organizational patterns, and his hemoglobin would drop again, as if the transfused cells were being converted or transformed by whatever was affecting his system. The messages in his blood became increasingly desperate and fragmented. Losing strength. Cannot hold connection. Time almost gone. Remember us. I realized we were running out of time to understand what was happening to David Martinez, and I was beginning to suspect that the answers we needed might not be found in any medical textbook or scientific journal. That Friday afternoon, I made a decision that would haunt me for months to come. Instead of following standard medical protocol, I decided to attempt direct communication with whatever was using David's blood as its medium. I prepared a fresh slide and positioned myself at the microscope, then did something I had never done in my entire medical career. I spoke directly to the blood sample. "If you can understand me," I said quietly, feeling foolish but desperate for answers, "I need you to help me understand what's happening to David." The red blood cells immediately began moving, reorganizing themselves faster than I had ever observed. Within minutes, a clear message appeared. "Finally, we have been waiting for someone to speak to us directly." The conversation that followed over the next several hours was unlike anything I could have imagined. Through the organized formations of David's blood cells, I learned that multiple consciousnesses had somehow become trapped within his body. They claimed to be individuals who had died in various circumstances but had been unable to move on to whatever comes after death. According to their communications, David possessed some rare neurological configuration that made him susceptible to this kind of possession. They described it as a doorway that most humans don't have, a unique brain structure that allowed displaced consciousness to take temporary refuge in a living body. David himself was unconscious, they explained, pushed into a dormant state while they occupied his physical form. The entities communicated that they had not intended to harm David, but their presence was slowly destroying his body's ability to produce healthy blood cells. They were essentially incompatible with human physiology, and the longer they remained, the more damage they would cause. They desperately wanted to leave but claimed they had become lost and couldn't find their way back to wherever they belonged. Dr. Chen, one message read, "We know this sounds impossible to your scientific mind, but consciousness is not limited to the living brain as your medicine believes. We are proof that awareness can exist independently of biological function." David's unique neural pattern created an opening, and we fell through by accident. I documented every message, every formation, every detail of this extraordinary communication. But as Friday evening approached, the messages became increasingly urgent and incoherent. The entities were losing their ability to maintain control over David's blood cells, and his physical condition was deteriorating rapidly. His latest lab results showed that his bone marrow had essentially stopped producing new blood cells. His white count was dropping dangerously low, making him vulnerable to any infection. His platelet count was falling, putting him at risk of internal bleeding. Most critically, his body was rejecting the transfused blood faster than we could replace it. Dr. Thompson called me to the ICU around 8 p.m. Friday with grave news. David's vital signs were becoming unstable, and his family had been contacted about his critical condition. His parents were driving from Phoenix and weren't expected to arrive until Saturday morning. We were facing the very real possibility that David would not survive the night. I returned to the laboratory and found that the blood sample was displaying what appeared to be a final message. "We understand now. Our presence is killing him. We will try to leave, but we may need help. If we cannot find the way, David will die, and we will be trapped forever in a dead body. This is not what we wanted." The formation held steady for nearly an hour, then gradually dissolved into random cellular movement. For the first time since Tuesday morning, David's red blood cells appeared to be behaving normally. No geometric patterns, no organized structures, no messages. just regular blood cells floating in plasma as they should. I immediately called the ICU to check on David's condition. Dr. Thompson reported that his vital signs had suddenly stabilized around 9 p.m., and his latest blood work showed his hemoglobin had stopped dropping. For the first time in days, David appeared to be medically stable, but my relief was short-lived. At 11:30 p.m., Marcus called me at home with news that made my blood run cold. Dr. Chen, you need to get back here immediately. We've got 3 more cases that just came in through the emergency department, all with severe unexplained anemia, and all showing the same cellular patterns we saw in David's blood. I drove back to the hospital through the empty Friday night streets of Denver, my mind racing with possibilities I didn't want to consider. If whatever had affected David was somehow spreading to other patients, we could be facing a medical crisis unlike anything in recorded history. When I arrived at the laboratory, Marcus showed me blood samples from 3 different patients who had been brought in within 2 hours of each other. A 28-year-old nurse from Denver General Hospital, a 45-year-old construction worker from Aurora, and a 19-year-old college student from the University of Colorado. All 3 had been found unconscious with severe anemia, and all 3 had blood samples displaying the same impossible organizational patterns. But these new samples were different from David's in disturbing ways. The cellular formations were more chaotic, more aggressive in their movements. The messages that appeared were fragmented and often incomprehensible. Lost. Confused. Cannot find David. Where is the door? The entities seemed to be scattered, separated from whatever central consciousness had been coordinating them in David's blood. I spent the rest of Friday night and early Saturday morning examining the new samples, documenting the cellular behavior, and trying to understand what was happening. The messages suggested that when the entities left David's body, they had somehow dispersed and attached themselves to other individuals with similar neurological susceptibilities. By Saturday afternoon, we had 7 cases. By Sunday morning, it was 12. All presenting with the same unexplained severe anemia, all showing the same impossible blood cell behavior, and all displaying increasingly desperate and fragmented communications through their organized red blood cells. The hospital administration was facing a crisis they had no protocol for handling. How do you explain to the medical community, the media, and the public that multiple patients are experiencing some form of consciousness possession that manifests through abnormal blood cell behavior? How do you treat a condition that challenges the fundamental understanding of life, death, and human consciousness? Dr. Sullivan called an emergency meeting with department heads, legal counsel, and representatives from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, who had been notified about the unusual cluster of cases. The meeting was held in the hospital's secure conference room on Sunday evening, and the atmosphere was tense with uncertainty and fear. We're dealing with something that has no precedent in medical literature, Dr. Sullivan began. We have 12 patients with identical presentations that cannot be explained by any known disease process, genetic condition, or environmental factor. The CDC is investigating potential infectious causes, but preliminary tests have been negative for all known pathogens. I presented my documentation of the cellular communications, the messages that suggested consciousness displacement, and the apparent connection between all the affected patients. The reaction from the CDC representatives was predictably skeptical, but they couldn't dispute the photographic and video evidence of the blood cell behavior. Dr. Martinez from the CDC's Special Pathogens Branch examined the samples himself and interviewed several of the affected patients. His preliminary report concluded that while the cellular behavior was unprecedented and unexplained, there was no evidence of infectious disease or environmental contamination that could account for the outbreak. But the investigation took an unexpected turn on Monday morning when David Martinez, our original patient, requested to speak with me privately. He had regained full consciousness over the weekend, his blood work had returned to normal, and he appeared to have made a complete recovery from his severe anemia. Dr. Chen, David said when I visited him in the ICU, I need to tell you something that's going to sound impossible. But I remember everything that happened while I was unconscious. I remember being pushed aside, displaced in my own body, while other minds took control. And I remember them talking to you, through my blood. David explained that during his unconscious state, he had been aware of the entities occupying his body but unable to communicate or regain control. He described it as being trapped in a dark corner of his own mind, while strangers used his physical form as a temporary shelter. The most disturbing part of David's account was his description of how the entities had originally found him. He claimed that he had always been sensitive to what he called spiritual presences, and had occasionally experienced what he thought were encounters with deceased individuals. On the night of his collapse, he had been contacted by what seemed to be a large group of lost souls who were desperately seeking help. They told me they were trapped between life and death, unable to move on because of traumatic or sudden deaths that left them confused and lost, David explained. They said I had a rare gift that could provide them temporary refuge while they figured out how to find peace. I agreed to help them, but I didn't understand that letting them in would nearly kill me. David's story, combined with the ongoing cases of similar blood cell behavior in other patients, painted a picture of something far more complex than a medical anomaly. We appeared to be dealing with some form of consciousness transfer that was medically impossible but undeniably real based on our observations and documentation. The implications were staggering. If consciousness could indeed exist independently of the living brain, if displaced souls could inhabit living bodies, and if certain individuals were naturally susceptible to this kind of possession, then everything we thought we knew about life, death, and human consciousness needed to be reconsidered. But the immediate concern was the growing number of affected patients and our complete inability to treat their condition using conventional medical approaches. The entities inhabiting these individuals were causing progressive destruction of their blood-forming organs, and without some way to facilitate their departure, all 12 patients faced the same life-threatening anemia that had nearly killed David. The CDC team was preparing to expand their investigation and bring in specialists from other government agencies, including researchers who had studied unexplained phenomena. The hospital was facing intense pressure to provide explanations for the cluster of cases, and rumors were beginning to spread among staff about the unusual nature of the blood work abnormalities. I realized that I was at the center of something that would either revolutionize medical understanding or destroy my career and credibility. The evidence was undeniable, but the implications were so far beyond accepted medical knowledge that presenting my findings publicly would likely result in professional ridicule and dismissal. As Monday evening approached, I faced a decision that would determine not only my future in medicine, but potentially the fate of 12 patients whose lives hung in the balance. The entities communicating through their blood were becoming increasingly desperate, and their messages suggested that time was running out for both them and their unwilling hosts. That Monday night, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of waiting for the CDC to complete their investigation or for hospital administration to determine the official protocol, I decided to attempt what David had described as facilitating the entity's departure. If consciousness could indeed be transferred into these patients, perhaps there was a way to help it transfer back out. I returned to the laboratory around midnight when the hospital was quietest. Marcus had volunteered to stay late, and together we prepared fresh samples from all 12 affected patients. What we found was both encouraging and terrifying. The blood cell messages had become more coordinated again, as if the scattered entities were somehow learning to communicate with each other across different host bodies. The formations in the samples were now displaying synchronized messages. Patient 3's blood cells would begin a sentence that patient 7's cells would complete. Mathematical equations started in one sample would be solved in another. It was as if we were observing a distributed consciousness operating across multiple biological systems simultaneously. "Marcus, look at this," I said, pointing to a message forming in patient 5's blood sample. "We have found each other again." The separation was frightening. "We are stronger together but weaker in each body. Help us gather so we can leave as one." The implications were staggering. The entities weren't just randomly possessing these individuals. They were actively coordinating their presence, using the blood cells as a communication network between host bodies. But their collective presence was accelerating the deterioration of each patient's hematological system. I spent the next 3 hours documenting the synchronized cellular behavior and attempting direct communication with the collective consciousness. Their responses revealed information that challenged everything I thought I understood about the nature of death and what happens to human awareness when the body dies. According to their communications, The entities were individuals who had died in traumatic circumstances that left them unable to accept their death or move on to whatever comes next. They described being trapped in what they called the between space, a realm where consciousness exists without physical form, but remains tethered to the earthly plane by unresolved emotional trauma. Dr. Chen, one message read, "We are not ghosts as your culture imagines them. We are consciousness that became lost during the transition from life to death. Some of us died suddenly in accidents. Others died with overwhelming guilt or fear that prevented acceptance of death. A few died while protecting loved ones and cannot let go of that responsibility." The entities explained that David's unique neurological configuration acted as a beacon that attracted lost consciousness. They described it as a doorway that allowed them temporary refuge in a living brain, but warned that most humans with this gift were unaware of it and had no training in how to safely manage such encounters. Your patient David has what ancient cultures called the sight, another message explained. In previous centuries, such individuals were trained as shamans, mediums, or spiritual guides who helped lost souls find peace. But your modern world has forgotten these practices, leaving people like David vulnerable and unprepared. The most disturbing revelation came when I asked about the other affected patients. The entities revealed that when they were forced to leave David's deteriorating body, they had desperately sought other suitable hosts. But finding individuals with the necessary neurological configuration was difficult, so they had been forced to inhabit people with only partial compatibility. The other vessels are not proper doorways, the message continued. We are damaging them more quickly because their minds cannot properly accommodate our presence. If we cannot find a way to leave soon, we will destroy all the bodies we inhabit, and both they and we will die together. That was 2 years ago. And I still wake up some nights thinking about those blood cells forming messages under my microscope. David Martinez made a full recovery after we found a way to help the entities move on. But the other 11 patients weren't so fortunate. The CDC classified the outbreak as an unexplained medical anomaly and sealed all the records. I couldn't continue practicing medicine after witnessing something that challenged every principle I'd been taught about life and death. Sometimes I wonder how many other doctors have encountered similar cases and simply chose to stay silent. If you've experienced anything like what I've described, you're not alone. And if you're a medical professional watching this, maybe it's time we started asking different questions about consciousness and what happens when we die.